Okay, so we've talked about all the events that led up to the Civil War. Kansas-Nebraska Act, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, and ultimately the election of 1860, which is when President Lincoln was elected. He was inaugurated or sworn in 1861, and of course that caused all the southern states to secede, starting with South Carolina, and ultimately 11 states joined, which we'll talk about in a second. So the first shots fired in the Civil War is where we're going to take off. You know, the North had soldiers stationed at Fort Sumter, which is located in Charleston, and then obviously that was in the Confederate States of America now, since the South had seceded. And so the Confederates wanted the Union troops to get out. They wouldn't leave. Lincoln needed to send them supplies, and this caused the Confederates to fire on the fort. The shelling lasted for over 34 hours, but nobody was killed. But these served as the first shots in the Civil War. And now we kind of got to wait and see what would happen next. But following Fort Sumter, you had 4 states that left: Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, all decided to join the Confederate States of America, and they chose Richmond, Virginia as the capital of their new nation. Robert E. Lee was elected to lead the Confederate Army, and he was basically the greatest Southern general. And he was chosen, he lived in Virginia. When his state seceded, he decided to team up and was offered that position, and he took it. It was a great honor to be considered the commanding general of such a large army. So the border states were slave states that stayed in the Union: Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. So these were all the states that still had slaves but chose to stay in the Union. So later, West Virginia eventually broke away from Virginia, and they joined the Union. So you had 24 Union states and 11 Confederate states. All right, so that's where we're at. All right, so the Anaconda Plan, once the Civil War had started, the Anaconda Plan was the northern strategy to conquer, invade, and strangle, like constrict, like an anaconda snake. You know, an anaconda eats its prey by coiling around it, constricting it until it suffocates and dies, and then they would eat it that way. And so they called it the Anaconda Plan. So the North wanted to kind of surround the South and constrict it, cut off anything it could. No supplies, no men could come in, no outside help, until they were eventually completely defeated. So they wanted to do 3 things. They needed a naval blockade of South's coastline, so no transportation or goods were allowed in and out of the South. So they used ships to get out there. Number 2, they needed to take control of the Mississippi River. This proved to be a very tough test, but this would split the Confederacy in 2 parts. So now you had 2 separate entities that had to talk back to each other, and the Union Army was in the middle of that on the Mississippi River. And they also needed to capture Richmond. This is what took the longest. All right, and this was, like I said earlier, the Confederates' capital. So those 3 things made up the Anaconda Plan. It was a way for the North to constrict or strangle the South into defeat. So the first battle of Bull Run, or at Manassas, Virginia, the Union attacked the Confederacy at a creek called Bull Run, hence where you get the name. The Union had the advantage at first, but the Confederacy launched a counterattack, and they would yell as they were attacking them, and this became known as the Rebel Yell. And it freaked out the Union soldiers so much that the Union soldiers just ran away. And what this war told us was that obviously this is going to be a bloody war. The Southern soldiers were going to fight for everything they stood for, and the war would last for a long time. So those 3 things kind of came out of the first battle of Bull Run. Well, we know it's going to be a long war because that's what the Battle of Bull Run just showed us. All right, so Lincoln appoints George McClellan to run the eastern part of his army, and Ulysses S. Grant to run the western part of the army. And eventually Grant takes over control of the entire army, but Grant is now just in charge of the west. So General Lee had a lot of success, so he decided to invade the North, and this kind of went against the Southern strategy. Initially, the Southern strategy was just prevent defense, all right? No, not let anybody in, defeat everybody who came in, and just hang back. But Lee had so much success in a series of battles, he decided to invade Maryland, which was in the Union side. So the North had heard of Lee's plans. Apparently, Lee had left some, or one of his helpers had left some plans coiled up around 3 cigars, and when the Union kind of came into that abandoned camp, they found those plans, and so that's how they got wind of General Lee's plans. And so McClellan met Lee at what is known as Antietam Creek near Sharpsburg, Maryland, and this became known as the Battle of Antietam. And it's in your song because it was the bloodiest battle in America, all right, to history to this point. I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands of American soldiers died, killing each other. So eventually Lee retreated, but because McClellan had really taken so much hits himself in casualties and soldiers, he chose not to follow him, which really probably could have finished off the Southern Army because they were so weak from this battle, and that just infuriated Lincoln. It made Lincoln so mad that he fired McClellan shortly after that battle. McClellan was known for acting slow. He was a very cautious leader, and that was frustrating to Lincoln, so that's why he got fired. So the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln was so confident after Antietam that he issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, which declared all slaves in the South to be free. So then you might ask, well, why not all slaves? You know, why not slaves in the border states? Why not slaves everywhere? Why just slaves in the Confederacy? Well, Lincoln didn't free all slaves because he believed that the Constitution did not give him the power to do so. All right, he couldn't free all slaves because the Constitution didn't say he had that power to, just grant property rights of freedom, which is what they viewed slaves as. So, but since it was wartime and Lincoln was in charge of the entire army, he viewed the proclamation as a military strategy. And he was able to issue that military strategy because he was the commander-in-chief of the army. All right, he was the ultimate one in charge. All right, so now this war was more than about just keeping the country together. It was also about freeing slaves. So we're fighting for liberty of a whole race of people that have been enslaved in the South for so long. So abolitionists and Union soldiers were thrilled, all right, but Northern Democrats thought the decision would only make the war longer. All right, and slaves began escaping and fighting for the Union because now the proclamation also allowed African American men to fight in the army. So at first, abolitionists were, kind of upset and like, why didn't you just do everybody? We wanted everybody. But ultimately, it really worked out to the North's advantage because a lot of African American men joined to fight on that side, which multiplied the soldiers that were available to the North. So the Battle of Gettysburg. All right, Lee met the Union General Meade on July 1st, 1863 at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It was 90,000 Union troops, 75,000 Confederate troops. All right, the turning point in this war, because it had been back and forth for a while, was known as Pickett's Charge. And Pickett was a Confederate leader, and he decided to take 15,000 of his men and attack right up the middle of the Union line. Now, in our heads, that makes no sense. Why would you attack the middle where all the weapons is? And obviously it didn't work out. It was a huge failure. The Union soldiers just basically mowed down those 15,000 men that had attacked them, and the Confederates were forced to retreat. Now, Lincoln was mad again because Meade, who suffered a lot of casualties himself, chose not to follow. But fortunately for the Union, the South really never recovered from this battle. They took a lot of huge hits in this, and it was hard for them to gain back. And even more important for the Union was that 3 days later, General Grant won a victory in Vicksburg, Mississippi. All right, he had been shelling this town of this Confederate town for a long time, and the Union now controlled the Mississippi River because Grant took Vicksburg, Mississippi. So phase 2 of the Anaconda Plan was ready to rock and roll, and Grant after this kind of became Lincoln's man. All right, they kept in close contact, and Grant pretty much ran the show from here on out. All right, so on November 19th, 1863, Lincoln gave a very famous speech at Gettysburg, where they were going to dedicate a national cemetery for all those that had died during that battle, because it was a very monumental battle in our nation's history. And so he gave the Gettysburg Address. It was only about 2 minutes long, but it proved to be one of the most famous speeches he ever gave. So that's the Battle of Gettysburg. So now we're kind of getting close to the end of the Civil War, and obviously there are tons of other battles that happened that we haven't talked about that we'll talk about in class. But another thing that happened was Sherman's march to the sea. So Union General Sherman, he was a Union general, his name was Sherman, took Atlanta from the South. He was able to take Atlanta and hold it, and he basically just decided he was going to march directly to the sea, and he destroyed everything in his sights. All right, his destruction path was 60 miles wide and 300 miles long. I mean, that is a lot of destruction. And Sherman waged what is known as total war. I really should have underlined that. Let me just do that real quick. Should have underlined that because total war is important. That's the concept that Sherman used. It's called total war, where you just destroy everything. He destroyed railroads, crops, towns. He didn't leave anything in his sight. And this really split the Confederacy, and it allowed the Union to gain a lot of control in the South. So Richmond falls and the war is over. Now we're starting to see it all wind down. So Sherman, after he did all this, his purpose was to meet up with General Grant, and they were going to try to finish off Lee and the Southern Army. So on April 2nd, 1865, the Confederate government and the Army left Richmond. And they burned a lot of stuff in sight, so the Union soldiers couldn't get it. And about a day later, the Union Army came in, and they found Virginia burning, but they were able to take Richmond. So the Union Army now has control of Richmond, which is the Confederate capital. All right, Grant, as Lincoln wanted him to do, followed Lee all over Virginia. And there were a series of small battles leading up to the end of this. There's a lot of fighting from April 2nd to April 9th. All right, and Grant followed Lee all over Virginia. And Lee really wanted to keep fighting, but he knew if he fought, he ultimately would just lose all his men, and he couldn't risk losing all those men to death. So on April 9th, 1865, General Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. All right, and Grant graciously, which is actually how Lincoln wanted to heal the nation. He just said all Confederate soldiers, all they had to do was lay down their arms, their guns, and they could even take their horses back and return home in peace. And he even fed the Confederate soldiers who were starving, because remember, we were trying to strangle them and not give them anything. So the way Grant ended this war and the way Lincoln wanted Grant to end this war sets up for how we're going to try to heal the nation. And like I said, try to heal the nation there.